Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion. A native of Los Angeles, California, Kirby Kim attended Harvard-Westlake High School, then went to Pomona College, where he majored in philosophy, politics, and economics. He spent the year after graduation teaching English in South Korea, and when he returned, moved to San Francisco to get his JD at Hastings College of the Law. Kirby moved out to New York in the spring of 2004 and got his first job in publishing, working for Charlotte Sheedy Literary, at that time an affiliate of Sterling Lord Literistic. He then moved to Vigliano Associates, where he gradually started representing his own projects. In 2008, he joined Endeavor, which is where we met, and the following year went over to William Morris when they merged. He stayed at WME for 5 years before joining Jankow Nesbit. Kirby represents both literary and commercial authors. He's most interested in receiving manuscripts that straddle the fence a bit with upmarket expression combined with a genre element or plot device. When it comes to straight literary work, he's alternatively drawn to rich, sweeping stories that try to encompass a time or a place, or tightly written, narratively innovative stories or voices with award potential. His commercial interests include thrillers and mysteries, speculative fiction, and young adult. He also represents a range of nonfiction, working with leaders and journalists in the areas of science, culture, and current affairs. He's also known for representing pop culture, in particular music and comedy. He's currently a board member of the Asian American Writers Workshop, and he lives in Phoenix, Arizona, with his wonderful wife and his beautiful children, one of which is named after me. Please welcome, not really. Please welcome Kirby Kim.
Thank you, and I did name him after you, so you can own it. You can totally own it.
I do.
Yeah. So thank you for having me. Thank you to the Writers League of Texas. It is a fantastic organization, and I'm searching for the same thing in Arizona and finding that it's falling short because the bar is set so high with what you guys do here. I've come before. I just moved to Phoenix, so I probably got to stay around for a little bit, but I came for the Agents and Editors Conference in the summer. I've come twice for that, and it is one of the best run conferences in the country. And I can say that having been to Wyoming, to Jackson Hole, to Aspen. I've done this around the country, and it's top notch. And the faculty there is fantastic. Becca is fantastic. She's an incredible resource. Becca is somebody that I used to go wander into her office and ask her for advice like every day. So anyway, that's enough of me building up the organization. But she's,
I'm already buying you dinner later. You're okay.
Yeah. No, just making sure. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my getting into this business and what kind of motivated me to do this, and then I'm going to talk about the role of the agent in the context of starting out with this book, Bearskin. So I was actually, as she read, I was in law school. I was one of those people that didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to be a doctor, and I wanted to be a good son. So I went to law school. And right away when I got there, I realized this wasn't the place for me. And the reason that is because I saw a lot of people passionate about the law, and I recognized that I didn't have that requisite passion. But I wanted to find that. And I liked learning. I wanted to use that degree in a different field that was part of a creative process and that had something kind of tangible artistically that I was seeing. I found a description of being a literary agent, and what I loved about it was the idea that I would wear a number of different hats, and that I could also be on the front line of discovery. To be that first person to a number of writers who advocated for them and recognized their incredible talent. So I started in 2004, and so I've been doing this for about 15, 16 years. the job was more challenging than I think I assumed. It is, you can't just be like, I like this, so it'll work, and other people will like it as well. The realities of publishing and the needs of publishers were things I learned along the way. So let me tell you about just kind of the day-to-day, and particularly in the context of this book, Bearskin. So what we thought was, as opposed to just telling you, what to do and how I do it, I'm going to talk to you specifically about how this book came into my orbit and how we made it a success. And Becca, you're not shy about interrupting me, but, continue with that. So Bearskin, I picked this specifically because James McLaughlin was part of my slush pile. Jim, and what I mean by slush is that we had no connection, and this was unsolicited. I was not aware of his work at all. I just opened my inbox, and I routinely, just about every day, get about 10 to 20 queries from writers who are looking for representation. I am unfortunately unable to respond to every query, but the truth is that I read every one. Particularly when I was younger and just building a list, that was the sole place that I found talent, actually. And so I know that there's gold in them, their hills, right? And so this was about 3, maybe 4 years ago. I was looking into it, and I got this query from Jim. And the general way that we ask writers to structure their queries at Jankow Nesbit is to give us a query letter, to give us a synopsis, and then the first 10 pages of the novel in the body of the email. Now, I want to caution all writers to follow the requests of agents at different agencies, because they all have different needs and they ask for it in different forms. Some would rather have an attachment, some don't need a synopsis, what have you. I think that is something that we're fairly overwhelmed, and while we love finding new writers, we are also looking for ways to cut down on our workload. And if you give us an excuse to kind of say, well, I don't think this is going to work out, like not following the directions that we're asking for in terms of the queries, it's not worth risking that as an easy delete.
And they can find that on your website, right?
Absolutely.
They're called submission guidelines.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So what I liked about Jim's query letter is that it was short. One of them, it was brief, and it was it showed that he had a firm grasp of his novel. He started with a very simple log line, and it was something in the vein of, I'm reaching out about representation for my novel Bearskin, which is a literary thriller and is of 80,000 words. Right away, I know what genre it is. He understands what conversation he's having, and it shapes how I look at the rest of the query letter as well. There was no hyperbole in there. There were no, kind of promises of riches. We talked a little bit about query letters and mistakes that sometimes writers make in their query letters. Jim gave me that log line very simply, and then he described the book, and he set it up very well. What we go for, what you should aim for, and what we aim for when we're writing our own cover letters to editors is what's back here, okay? This is not a summary of the book. What it is basically just a way to get you to open the book, right? Every stage of this process is just to get people to read a little more, right? And so what he did with his query letter was he made me want to read those 10 pages, right? Oftentimes what happens is I read a paragraph, and in a paragraph I can tell if the writing is there. So if that paragraph works, then I'm reading the first page. If that page works, then I'm reading 10 pages. If those 10 pages work, I'm asking for 100. And if that 100 still has me, then I'm reading the whole novel generally. What I want to encourage you guys as writers is to recognize and just appreciate, not just for us, but for the end consumer, that their attentions are constantly being drawn. Our attentions are constantly being drawn in other places. And so try not to think I'm going to save that thing for later, right? Try to appreciate that you've got to keep that attention all throughout.
And I want to ask about the synopsis that you guys ask about. Is that also, what do you consider a synopsis to be? Because I think we talk about synopses all the time here and in events and programs, and I have an idea of what I believe it to be, but I think you can find many different definitions. So are you looking for truly the entire, you want to know what happens in that book in a synopsis? What do you want?
Yeah, I mean, synopsis is a tricky thing because the requests of the Jankow kind of website are things that were there before I got there. To be honest, I don't need a synopsis.
What does Jankow want? What do they consider a synopsis to be?
Yeah, so in terms of Jankow, and I think what most of the agents are looking for is basically a beginning, middle, and end. Okay, you don't have to get too in the weeds, but you've got to show that this is a story, right?
Okay.
And you got to show who the central characters are, and you want to explain what the central tension is.
And no cliffhangers in a synopsis, right?
No.
Yeah.
No cliffhangers.
Okay. All right, I'm going to move you along because I want to hear more about how this. So his letter caught your attention. What happens?
So his letter
next?
caught my attention. I read the 10 pages. I read the first pages, and what I recognize right away is a kind of efficiency in the language. Immediately, he starts with an action sequence, but it's not. What I find sometimes is there's too much dialogue right away, and it's like somebody yells, and there's always an exclamation point in the first line, and it's like that's not what we necessarily mean in terms of starting with action. The action here was he was fixing his house and clearing out a beehive that was stuck in the walls. And there was a certain visceral quality to it and attention. And what he demonstrated very quickly was his voice. He demonstrated a bit of an expertise about nature, which I appreciate and I'm always looking for. The scene itself caught my attention in the way that he created this atmosphere out in this cabin on a nature preserve in Virginia. It characterized it in a different way. It was almost surreal, the way that he made this feel. And that was unique. And so it made me really want to read the rest of it.
So when you say an expertise in nature, what you're saying is that you appreciate someone who shares an expertise, not necessarily of nature, but of something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm very much in the learning as you read camp, and I love to learn. And, we don't talk too much about research in writing, but I think, I just personally appreciate a lot of expertise and kind of real life knowledge that comes into a story. I asked for 100 pages, and I started reading the 100 pages, but at a certain point I gave it to my assistant, and I just said that there's something here. Can you read the rest? She got back to me after asking for the full manuscript, and she said there is something here. So that's something you should know about the way that sometimes we have to delegate kind of responsibilities. I will read the first 10 pages or something, and I'll just see promise there. And then I have to sometimes focus on my client work or something like that. And then I'll have my assistant read, because she knows me so well. She'll say, there's this and this. I think you'd like it. So I read this after her endorsement. And I got in touch with Jim. And what I told him is I had an initial conversation. He wasn't talking to anyone else at that time. But, I told him about my passion for it. I told him about the way that I work. I told him about my vision for also what work maybe needed to be done before we could go out.
And would you say those are questions that anyone would want to ask when they're in that position, or that you would want to find out from an agent, those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've also talked a bit about, if you do get an offer for representation from someone, how do you know this is the right person for you? A couple of things right off the bat. One is that, I think most agents, when they do reach out and say, I'm interested in working with you, I don't know that many that say, you got to let me know over the weekend, right? Or in 2 days or what have you. I think generally it's fine, and it's reasonable to say, I appreciate your interest. I'm going to think about things, and I'm going to give people, say, a week to get back to me that are still considering or something like that. And I think you want to do that due diligence and let those other agents know that you've been offered representation, because what you want to do is you want to have options. You want to see what else is out there a bit. You want to have other conversations. You want to have some frames of reference.
I love that you're saying that, because I think sometimes we think, okay, if someone says yes, I have to say yes. I can't, miss this opportunity. And in some ways, if somebody is pressuring you very quickly to say yes, maybe that's also a red flag that they aren't the right fit for you.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times if I'm the right person, then then it usually works out. I've communicated in a way that you respond to. I'm saying things about your work that I love. I'm pushing you in the directions that you want to go.
So tell me then, in those conversations, what are some of the red flags for you? If you're talking to a potential client, what could they say that would make you say, maybe I should slowly back out of the room?
An unwillingness to edit. That's a big one.
Unwillingness to edit.
An unwillingness to edit, to not want to be pushed and to not have that, to roll up their sleeves and do some work if it's required. I think an impatience, when are you going to go out with it? Okay, well, I really was planning on having this sold in the summer, it takes how long it takes. This is also a good example. This took a year of editorial work. So those are things that are red flags, for sure. I'm interviewing you too. We're interviewing each other, right? Do we have the right rapport? And the LTS rule, right? Life's too short. If I sense that there is going to be a lack of chemistry here, then I might just say, this doesn't feel right. And I don't know if this is going to work.
Well, and I love something that you said yesterday, which was also that you don't want writers to be afraid of their agents, that you want them to also feel to feel comfortable with that person. So if you're talking to someone and you feel like very intimidated by them, or you feel like you can't be yourself, then that would be another, I assume, red flag for a client.
Absolutely, right? For a client. And I think this is where it comes down to, okay, that first offer of representation. Let's just say it's a big agent who is doing that. But I hear all the time certain agents scare their writers, that their writers are actually scared to death of talking to them, scared to death of saying something in conflict with them. That is, some writers I've read like that kind of hard-nosed, badass kind of, agent, tough as nails. And a lot of writers, and I think most writers, would rather be able to come to their agent with uncomfortable conversations and to work it out. To say that, look, I'm having real trouble with my editor. They're pressuring me about this cover, and I just really don't love it. You don't want the agent who says, look, this is what you got to do. This is, they paid us, you just got to put up and shut up,
Cool.
So I think you want to be able to have that conversation. You want an advocate. You want to get a sense of how they work with their writers. Also, we've talked about look, what's your usual response time? Okay. Do you prefer to talk on the phone or over email? Things of that nature, just to set expectations.
So you guys had a phone call, and it was love.
So that's what I like to do. I like to get on the phone. I like for them to hear it in my voice. I just said I have a vision for it. I think I know exactly where to go with it. I already have a running list of editors in my head. A lot of times that's a lot of when I know that this is a good fit, is that I know exactly who to go to. And so we spoke, and then he thought about it. I gave him whatever time he needed, and then I sent him a retainer agreement. And a retainer agreement outlines just what our relationship is. And Jankow works in the sense of we do retainers book by book. So this was just for Bearskin. You should know that standard industry commission is 15%. For domestic and world deals, but if it's a situation where I sell the the domestic rights and we're going to go out into the foreign market to sell in Germany or the UK or Spain, that's a 20% commission standard. And it's a little more because very often we're using sub-agents and we split commissions with them. What I sometimes get asked is how does film and TV rights work? And what we do is we generally partner with a book to film or TV agent, and that person shares in our commission. So you don't get commission more for those rights. It's still 15%, and we split 7.5 with that book to film agent. There are other parts of the contract, but that is generally it. If you see anything that raises a red flag, in particular, any kind of reading fee, anything that you have to go out of pocket for, that should be a big red flag for you.
So he signs your
So he signs, and he's an attorney, so, he has questions, and, I'm happy to answer them. I tell him where we can make some accommodations, but where also, we just can't budge, right? So he signs, and what I generally do is I read the manuscript again. Okay, the first time I read it on submission, I'm kind of just trying to read it as a reader, and I might have some notes swirling in my head, general ideas, but I read it again knowing now where the book is going and what the end is, and that's when I take out my pen. What I'll send is an editorial letter and usually a red line of the manuscript. And at that stage, usually what I'm doing is big picture things, right? Character arcs, themes, big set pieces, big plot points that need to be figured out. And I'm not getting into the nitty gritty of line editing at that point. Can we just talk about the sort of editorial side of an agent for a second? Because I think the rub can be, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, is that the writer needs to have done a tremendous amount of work on the manuscript before it even is queried to you, right? Before it's submitted. So anyone who's thinking, oh great, he edits, so I don't really have to revise at all. I can just send a query letter and Kirby will do it. But really there's sort of 3 stages of editing: the writer's own revisions and edits. It goes to an agent. Ideally, you're working with an agent who will also dig into the manuscript, and they all dig in at varying levels, I think, and that's something to know. And then it goes to a publisher, and you have an editor who digs in. That's right.
Right? Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
But the best way that we all work is for at every stage of the process, we take it as far as we possibly can, right? So what you should be doing, you should be sick of this thing by the time you send it to me, okay? What you should not be doing is thinking, it's good enough, right? I'll send it over there and start querying, and then you realize, I can make that scene better, or, I'll do this work, and then a few weeks later we talk about this. The huge red flag is, a month after I've asked to see more material, you email me and say, I did some more work on it. Can you take a look at this draft as opposed to that one, right? That is a huge red flag to me that, 1, you're not respecting the process, okay? But 2, that, there's probably even more work that needs to be done on it. So I kind of check out after that. But what I'm trying to do here with the editorial process is I'm trying to do everything I can to get it as far as we can both take it, using my knowledge of how the attention spans of editors are so short, what they're looking for, how do we keep that tension throughout. Pacing is huge, and it's something I learned later as I submitted things. So I generally go through the manuscript. I would say I read it probably about 4 times before I actually submit it. You'll come back, and obviously the changes in the editorial work will get more incremental as we go along. But the point is not that it's going to be perfect, because it's still a subjective process. An editor is going to look at whatever we do and say, I want to do this, and I think you should do this. The point is that I'm looking at it as well, and I'm thinking, 1, I've asked you questions that you've answered, dealt with, or changed. Or 2, we know that there are certain issues of the manuscript, but we're not seeing a way to fix that thing, or without disrupting it, or really messing it up, And so we can acknowledge that, look, I still have some concerns about this, but I'm not totally sure how to address it. we've taken it together as far as we can. Let's go out and test the market.
All right, so what happens next? What happened with Bearskin?
Right, so with Bearskin, I basically put together a submission list of a number of editors. That list can be anywhere generally from like 9 or 10 to 20, 25 people, depending on how many places I can send it to where it's appropriate, right? These imprints within these publishers all have a very specific personality, and the editors within the imprints are looking for very specific things. Okay, so it's actually pretty clear for us who to matchmake with. And there are a number of houses that, yes, they do fiction, but they don't do a literary thriller. So I'm not even going to go there. So the number of that list changes, but I will put that together. I will put together my own query letter, essentially, which is a cover letter. And then I will call up each editor on my list and pitch them on the phone before sending it over. And the reason I do that is I want them to hear my passion. I want them to hear the way I talk about it. My aim is to get them to put this to the top of their pile tonight when they go home, because I know that there's 9 other agents doing the exact same thing today.
So what happened with Bearskin when you sent it out?
So with Bearskin,
how many people would you say you submitted that to?
I kept it pretty tight. I think I had a very clear idea of who I wanted to go to, especially as a first round. I knew that it was a little bit weird as a thriller. Those surreal elements kind of come out. It doesn't have a whole lot of like bang bang violence, So I was going to literary houses that do this kind of thing, actually.
Can I ask a question too?
Yeah.
Well, obviously I can ask anything I want, but was it called Bearskin when you were submitting it?
Why, you don't like it?
No, I'm just curious. First of all, I'm assuming a bear mauls someone in this book, but was it Bearskin, and what kind of conversation do you have about the title before you submit something?
We do have a conversation about the title, and I think like sometimes I will. I love the title. I've always loved it.
I do too. I think it's a great title.
Yeah, no, it doesn't sound like it.
Was it called Bearskin when you submitted it?
Yes, it was called Bearskin. It has always been Bearskin.
Simple question, Kirby. All right, moving on.
So I sent it out, and what was great was, look, like this process can take weeks, months, and sometimes it can happen overnight, to be frank. The main thing is that once that first editor comes to you having read it and confessing their passion, things can move, right? I can start putting pressure on other editors. I can start thinking of a date for closing, right? And what I'm trying to do is build a kind of buzz and a kind of tension and urgency around the project and develop a feeling of FOMO, a little bit of that, right? The fear of missing out. So I got some interest within the first couple of days from an editor saying, I'm loving this, keep me posted. I take that interest and I let people know that for their own purposes of timing, you better put this up on your stack because it sounds like somebody's interested. And, that pushes some people to pass, frankly, and that's fine. I need to know who's not into this. What I want is information, right? But I also want people to read it and to get supporting reads because they need to give it to other people within their house that support them and see it as well. And so what I ended up with was an auction. Actually, no. I didn't end up with an auction. I had a preemptive offer.
What does that mean exactly?
So somebody made me an offer trying to take the book off the table. And so that and when that happens, usually what they're doing is they're going to be fairly aggressive because they know they want it, but they don't want anybody else to have a chance to compete with them, They will almost always put a ticking clock on that offer and force you to make a decision, say, by the end of the day or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And it's brutal.
Yeah, it is. And especially if you don't have information, right? So at that point, I'm scrambling to get to know how serious other people are and letting them know that, look, somebody's trying to take it off, right? So I let all these people know. And again, some people are going to pass. Some people are going to say, like, I'm into it, but I'm not loving it. So it sounds like you have an enthusiastic person. I'm just going to let step aside. But then there are some people who are like, wait, right? And what I'm trying to get a sense of then is like, where are you? What are you thinking? At that point, what I told this house was, you know, I don't think this is enough, essentially. I just said, you know what? I have a certain amount of interest. And at that point, I think I had 4 or 5 houses interested. And I just said, you know what? The interest is high enough that, you know, we can.
And where is the author in that process?
Oh, I'm talking to them. Right. I'm sharing this with them.
And so he's sort of making that decision with you.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. And to be completely honest, if he said at that point, I want to take the offer, I would take the offer. My job, the way that I see my job is, you know, this is your career. These are your books. I'm going to give you all the knowledge I have to make the most informed decision for yourself, right?
Well, and I assume that there's also sort of a gamble there, because if the preemptive offer is coming from the house and the editor that you really want the book to end up with,
right,
there's probably room to say, well, if you came up this much, you could take it off the table.
Absolutely.
But because then you're worried about them losing it in the auction situation, right, and someone else outbidding them, right? So you kind of have to really, these are the reasons why you want a good agent, because they're thinking about all of that stuff.
Absolutely. So in this situation, you know, to be honest, there was an ideal house that I had in mind and that I had talked openly with Jim about. And the person trying to preempt was not the ideal house. And I told him that. I told him what I thought, but he could go ahead and take the money and go. So I turned that down, and then what happened was I set a date for the closing, and then another house came in with a preempt. And they wanted to take it off, and they were where we wanted to be.
Were they the ideal? Well,
it was the ideal matchup, right?
Okay.
And it was Zach Wagman at Echo Press. And you know, I had different kinds of interests. This house, you know, look, if that other house had come in at a higher level, okay, that changes things and what it means to them.
Because I also would assume that you are not submitting to anyone that you don't want to sell the book to.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So if someone's offering and they end up being the highest bidder, that's still wonderful because there's somebody that you would want to sell to.
Yeah. None of these people are people I would have said, oh, man, you know, worst case scenario, right?
Yeah.
We're
Okay.
just settling, especially in the first round, at least. So Zach came in, he tried to preempt it at a certain level. I told Jim, and I said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to get him up. I'm going to try to get more rights. I'm going to try to improve the payout. I'm going to try to do these things that are realistic so that we can get the best offer from them, preemptive offer from them, and then let's see where we are. And so he did that, and we got to a certain place, and we were both very comfortable taking it off the table, given the information we had. Echo had done, and some of the things that informed my opinion were the fact that Echo had done a book called 4th of July Creek by a writer named Smith Henderson, and had done it really well. And it was set in Appalachia. It was a literary novel. They were doing thrillers, but really kind of upmarket thrillers with beautiful writing. It just all felt. They also did Philip Meyer's The Sun. You know, there's a gritty kind of commonality in their list. And so when Echo is going to reviewers and independents and saying, look, we think this is in conversation with these other books that, remember we told you they were going to be big, and they were big? Well, this is the next one. They have that credibility, right? And they know who to talk to be gatekeepers and endorsers and whatnot. So it felt very good. It felt like the right house. The editor I knew was going to stay there for a while. That was also something important for me, because he was seeing this as a trilogy. So I wanted that consistency throughout.
Okay, so it's with Echo. So let's move further down the process towards publication and some of the things that you as an agent do or did with this book to make sure that it was set up in the way that you wanted it to be.
Right. So at that point, we negotiate the contract, of course. That I just want to mention that you don't have to hire a separate attorney. We have in-house attorneys. They understand these contracts. They understand how to do them. And we basically, I kind of step back at that point. The editor is working editorial on the manuscript. I don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, so the editor should lead. But about 6 months to 8 months later, we now have a finished manuscript. Let me back up real quick. Actually, before that, covers. Actually, cover conversations happen before the book is actually done, because they need to have the branding of the manuscript, branding of the book done early enough for them to launch it and to do all these other things in-house. So they will actually start sending you covers earlier than you're done with the manuscript. And luckily for this, this is very close to the final, what we had before. Okay, but we do have situations where they oftentimes send you one cover, right? Mm-hmm. They send you the thing at the end of a long process, and the pressure is implied that you should accept this. So this is an important part of the process, because this is very much at the core of what an agent does, which is convey uncomfortable information. They send something, and what I do is immediately when it comes through, I just say, don't say anything, let's talk, okay? So I'll let them sit with it. We'll get on the phone and I'll say, what do you think? And I don't give my opinion. I just want to know what they think. What's your knee-jerk reaction? Tell me everything. And if they say, I hate it, okay, tell me. What do you like about it, though? Is there anything you like about it? Are there elements we can keep? Are there elements we can appreciate? What we're trying to do is couch the bad information with a little bit of good on either side. And there's a way that you can convey even the worst reaction to a cover that still appreciates the effort that they put into it. Because what you haven't seen is that there is an art director, there is a cover artist who has done a bunch of these, right? They've tried to do a lot of things and do justice, and they've had meetings, and they've whittled through them, and they've really labored over it. And, ultimately it is kind of a marketing decision. And so they have poured over things, and they have decided that this is the one that will work the best for the market. They are trying to do what's best for the book, and I think it helps to appreciate that. But that having been said, I'm there to be the bad guy and say, we really don't like this. Let's try
right. So
else.
A couple of things that just really quickly, ultimately the house, am I correct, can go with whatever cover they want to contractually, yes. Unless you're, James Patterson, or you're someone who has it built into your contract. But the house wants the author to, of course, be happy with the jacket on their book. They don't want someone going out and selling a book that they're not thrilled with. So you have to deal with that situation. Yeah. But then really the question being, or I love what you're saying, which is you're the middle person so that you can preserve the relationship the writer has with a publishing house.
That's right. And I always want you to be the good guy, right? Even if what I'm conveying is my writer doesn't really love it, I'm going to be the one sending that message, right? I'm going to be the one that says, you guys have to change it. That's generally my role. My role is to convey and to liaise amongst us. And the truth is, there are going to be times where I say, I don't think this is what's best for the book. I'm going to be very straightforward, and I think most good agents will tell you, like, what you are doing right now potentially hurts the chances of the book's success. I'm just going to say that, But if you want to keep going along this path, I am, going to advocate for you. But again, it is about you make your own bed. Anyway, so let's move on from the cover.
A little further, because I want to definitely get to Ted Chiang before we have to stop. So let's talk, let's skip ahead, if we will, in Bearskin to actual publication of the book, and then maybe talk a little bit about what the agent's role is post-publication. Mm-hmm. And then I'd love for you to talk about the award that the book recently won and kind of...
Yeah, so post-publication, and just a little bit about, publicity, we are talking, when the book is done, we have about 9 months there where we try to get as many blurbs from great authors that we can. And it's generally me, Jim, the author, and the editor. It's us. So actually, you'll see an Ace Atkins blurb here. That was the editor. That's him calling in a favor and saying, can you look at this? I think you're going to love it. CJ Box also gave us a blurb. We try to get those so that, obviously it helps with the book buys, but also if you can get that really early, then it raises the profile of the book with reviewers as well. So,
and that's one of the reasons why it's great for writers to really be aware of the authors that are represented by agents that you're querying, because it is true. Until I worked in publishing, I didn't realize that all of those quotes on the book, they're all just coming from connections. Like rarely is it that, Nelson DeMille just found a manuscript and was like, in fact, I hate to tell you guys this, but it's true. Sometimes they're not even writing those quotes. They haven't even read the manuscript. They're getting, what do you want me to say about this great novel? And so if you're choosing, especially between two agents, and there's a couple ideal authors on the list, even the house list of the agency that are really important to you, I think that can be a factor if you're not, sure who to go with. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so publication.
So the book is published, and I think the main thing was that we, in order to talk about publication, what happened after, we do have to talk about the efforts that were going into it just on the eve, which is that we were sending in op-eds. We were reaching out to pitch, interviews, pieces that he had written, small things, nonfiction, little essays that related to the book in some way. It's really important for a book like this to try to get, say, a Barnes & Noble Discover pick so that we have Barnes & Noble's support. Indie Next, huge, right? Especially for a book like this. And hopefully we get the Amazon kind of book of the month or something like that. There are these things that lead up to it. And, all of that stuff just helps put this in the right place so that if readers really start responding to it, it's there, it's available, it's distributed. The information that I want to know are where the status is on those things, but also what the retailer orders are. And so I asked for an initial print run, and the strength of that print run helps me determine what the demand is from the retail market. When the book came out, we had a few things that worked right away. So we did get the retailer support. We did get Discover. We did get Indie Next. We did get an Amazon kind of category best of the month. We got a New York Times Roundup review, and that was huge for us. Basically, they had 4 writers, 4 debuts to watch, and this was one of 4. It was the year that Rhys Aro-Kwan had The Incendiaries out. There were a couple other books, but this was the only one that mattered to me. So that came out. We had great Goodreads support, and it was in Marilyn Stasio's New York Times Roundup, for kind of crime thrillers. So it showed up in the Times. It was reviewed by the Washington Post. There are definitely places that we're targeting and really hoping for a book like this.
And when you say we, what you mean is obviously there's a publicist in-house, but it sounds like as an agent, agents these days are really involved in understanding what the plan is and then also using their own connections when appropriate to help get their clients' work out there.
Right. So, there was, an editor at Crime Reads where I just reached out to him directly and made sure that he was aware of it. I have a friend at iBooks, and I sent him a galley. For this one, what was great was, because we had those early blurs, because we had all that other stuff, I really didn't have to keep hounding the publisher about it. That train was running, and they knew that they had an asset that they can use, that they can sell, and so it just was a rare ideal situation. And the truth is they didn't pay a ton for it, right? It wasn't a preemptive offer that was very much more than the other preemptive offer. But when you have that alignment of house and branding and author and book, then a lot happens on its own, and I was betting that the upside was going to be worth it.
Well, and you're also thinking about how much you sell it for, because there's a point where you're selling it almost for too much for the book to earn out, for the publisher to buy a second book, for the publisher to buy a third book.
Right.
Not to say that you wouldn't take $1 million if someone offered you $1 million, but those are things you can think about as well. Do I want this to go to auction and sell to not the right person for so much money that maybe this will be the first book and only book of this person's career?
Right.
Will you talk about him as an author? Because I love that he came through the slush pile, but you also told me, I believe, that he was 52 when his debut novel was published.
Yeah. So what's wonderful is, Jim had worked on this novel for years and years. It was actually something that he had gotten interest in because he had published a story in the Missouri Review years before. An agent had reached out then because it won an award. And he had written a version that the agent didn't like, right? And said there were issues with it. So he actually shelved the project. And then he came back to it years later, and then he started submitting again. But he was doing some short stories. He was working as a lawyer. But until it was really ready, he didn't start sending it out again. And it ended up being a debut in his 50s. And it was just as exciting. It wasn't something that was held against him in any way. It was just...
So dispelling that idea that I think sometimes people have, that publishers only want, agents only want a certain age, a certain writer.
That's right.
It's not true.
That's
that
right.
Ultimately, it's the writing and the story.
Yeah, and what I want to say is, look, Jim is not from the New York publishing, kind of community, that whole incestuous world, sometimes. He lives in Salt Lake City, and he is older, right? And he has other interests than just writing, right? He's an avid outdoorsman. All of that stuff that I think sometimes writers that aren't on the coast think are disadvantages are assets in this book. All that kind of knowledge, that understanding of pacing and working on his craft, his outdoorsy nature and how that informed this. The fact that he's not writing another New York story. These are all things that worked for him and us when I was pitching and what they loved about the book. The book was never on the bestseller list, but it was a huge success for everyone. And that the crowning part of that was that it was nominated for Best First Novel for an Edgar Award. And it was going against Delia Owens, Where the Crawdads Sing. I don't know if you guys know that book. It has been number one for weeks and weeks.
Not know that
weeks.
book? It's I didn't realize that it beat Delia Owens. I want to high five you.
Yeah,
Kirby,
we'll do it.
Don't leave me hanging.
We're doing it now.
Yeah.
All right. I kind of had conceded that it probably wouldn't win as a result.
Right.
But it did win. And so it's great. Not that it moves copies necessarily that much, but it was this wonderful
cool,
kind
though.
of final moment.
Yeah.
It was great.
So I want to move past this book to the Ted Chiang, because we don't have a ton more time, but I know this is a very different experience and a very different author and a very different situation. I'm going to encourage you to maybe
Be faster?
maybe just do what you would tell your author to do when they're telling a story.
Be efficient?
Yeah.
Okay, so quick story. So Ted Chiang, this is actually his first collection. And what happened with Ted, what I want to talk about Ted in particular is, this is a short story writer. He only writes short stories, okay? He takes 1 to 2 years on each short story, okay? Since 91, he's only published about 15 short stories, and yet he is a legend in the science fiction community. Every story, he doesn't let it go until he knows it's absolutely done. And you can see it. You can feel it when you read it. It feels like these things are birthed whole. And what had happened with him was that he had a short story collection that a publisher had put out in 2002. They did not support it. It went out of print after a few years, and he was with this agent that he was with because she represented Ursula Le Guin. She had passed away. So the people who had taken him over weren't real advocates for him. Now, here's a writer. He was not going to write a novel. He is not a novel writer. It's very clear about that. he was only doing short stories, his book had not worked, and he thought he was basically at a dead end in his career in a certain sense. He's like, well, I guess I'll just keep writing these stories and nothing will happen, and I can't leave this agent because agents only want novels. And that is not necessarily true. I had come to him very late because I wasn't super aware of the science fiction community. I was a general interest reader, and what was happening in this world was that books like Station 11 were succeeding. People like Kazuo Ishiguro was writing a fantasy. What was happening was the genre was moving more mainstream and becoming general interest. And so I was doing a lot of random kind of wormholing online. Somebody would recommend this story and I'd just go there and read it, and then that would lead me to another story. And I stumbled upon a story called Tower of Babylon that was online. And I read it and I was just blown away. And for me, I felt like I had never read anything so revelatory. And I wanted to find out what was happening with him. And what I had seen was that his one collection was published by a small press, and it was, it had been out for a while. I knew that there were other stories, and so what I did was I reached out and just said, hey, to his publisher, and just said, if you don't mind reaching out to him and letting him know if he's ever interested in having a conversation with another agent who does more general trade books, I think that this is something that would appeal to the general trade now. And that appealed to him. He reached out to me and he told me straight up, I'm not doing a novel. And I said, that's fine. But I would like to reach a wider readership. And, thus began this kind of conversation with him about what my vision was for his career. And at that time, there was already a film option. Now, I'll tell you this, that film options happen quite a bit. Like, a lot of novels get film options. What varies is how much is paid for them. But you'll get film options that are free sometimes. Most of them are $5,000. A lot are $10,000. Very rarely they go up and beyond that. But he had a film option on one of the stories in here called Story of Your Life. And that became the movie called Arrival a few years ago with Amy Adams. And it was up for an Oscar. And that stuff hadn't started happening until a few months after I reached out to him and our relationship cemented. And so what I did was I had an arrangement with the small press that he was with. We agreed that I could go out and try to resell that collection, this collection, which had already been out for however many years, so that it could bootstrap on the enthusiasm of the movie that was coming out. That press, the small press, could not handle the distribution needs or the print runs to sell as many copies as possible, and they understood that, and they wanted the best for him. So I had an auction where I was reselling that right and also selling the new collection, of which there still needed to be 2 stories written in it.
Can I ask, maybe this is more in the weeds than it needs to be, but what happened with that other agent when you took that out to other publishers? Did you make an arrangement with them to share commission? Was that a part of that? You don't have to tell us the terms of it, but more that factored in, I assume.
Yeah, and I was fine with letting them keep the commissions that came from this sale and me taking my commission on the new deal.
I love that you're saying that, because I know I can think of authors right now, but that oftentimes if you have an agent and you have a book with them and then you leave them for any reason, there's this concern of what happens to the stuff that I already have. Now I've got an agent attached to it who's not invested in my career. It's absolutely true that if an agent is interested enough in an author, you're fine with helping them work with and doing things with previous books, even if you're not getting commission on it, because you recognize that it's a part of the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm going to make you move a little bit into something you said earlier today, which is about the writing of Ted Chiang, and sort of, I loved what you said about there's nothing superfluous in what he's giving you? I think just the craft of what he does could be interesting for folks here to be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is patience with yourself, patience with your ideas, right? The thing that I think is so great about TED, and that I encourage all of my writers to do, and in particular in the wake of being introduced to TED, was, the prose is very clear, but every element of the story is germane to the story. And what happens is that he has these elements and these concepts and oftentimes a speculative aspect. And what happens is that he comes to an ending that is both surprising and inevitable at the same time. And as a result, it feels like a magic trick. And I think I just encourage all my writers to keep that in mind. I think that's a general a strategy just for great storytelling, right? Is if you know after the first act exactly where this is going and what's going to happen, that is a boring story, right? And how many reviews do you read online where you're like, well, I guess what was going to happen, and it unfolded exactly as I thought it would, right? How much, that's not being a great storyteller, in my book at least. You want to surprise them, you want to keep them on their toes, and I think if you can move them at the same time, then you've got a trifecta, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what is so wonderful about the stories, is that, everybody talks about how they're science fiction, but they're just as moving as anything by, say, Alison Munro. By the end of it, the language is as clear. He's been called the Laurie Moore of science fiction because he only writes short stories, and the language is so clean.
And we wanted to have a copy of his book that just published on Tuesday here, but book people sold out pretty much immediately, unfortunately. But what is the title of the new book? Can you tell folks?
The new book is called Exhalation. And it's a new collection of 8 stories. And actually, what I was able to do for that, and this kind of ties in a little bit with what an agent does as well, and the all hands on deck feel, is I had reached out to the New York Times Magazine. They have a special labs edition, labs section. I knew the editor there because we had communicated when she was at Wired. She had told me that she was a fan of TED. Now she was at this other place, and I said, look, would you think about, are you doing fiction there? And she was like, I'm doing fiction very sparingly. And what I've done is in the last year and a half, I did a special insert for Rachel Kushner, and I did one for Colson Whitehead. And I asked her if she would consider doing one for Ted Chiang. And I sent her the story collection. I told her what was available. She told me I need something that's about 15,000 words. I said, okay, here's this story. It hasn't been published. She said, would it be open to some edits? And can we shorten it a little bit? And I was like, yeah, okay, I'll talk to them. And the Sunday before last, if you have the New York Times, there is a special insert that is of one of the unpublished stories in here, and that goes to 1 million people. And really, there was no better thing to kind of launch the publicity for the book.
That's so cool.
So when you were talking about preempts, you mentioned that there's like a time limit on them. Is that a situation where, like, does your author speak to the editor before they agree to sell their book to them, like to make sure it's a fit, or are they totally relying on your recommendation?
I generally do make people talk. Yeah, I it's important that, again, can you communicate with this person? Do you feel like they get you? Generally, I always have, and you did too, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then ultimately, that can even make a decision, right? You might talk to an editor, and even though they're at a great house and they are talking about the book in a way that makes sense, it just doesn't feel like a good fit.
Yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Usually, most of the time, we've already had those conversations, though. There's like an editorial conversation, but by the time the preamp comes, that has already happened, right?
When you're evaluating an author about whether you want to take them on, how important is it to you what their social media presence is like, or that sort of thing? Do they have to have a large Twitter following?
Depending on the project, it is more relevant. But when it comes to, there are times when who you are matters a lot, right? So if you're doing prescriptive nonfiction, right, you're telling people how to eat. Are you a doctor? Are you a chef at a prominent restaurant? You know, there are personalities, right? And what matters for those people is your following, right? And so those things matter more. It doesn't matter at all.
For fiction, so let's
for
talk
fiction, I really don't care, to be honest. And I would continue with this conversation and saying, look, what I do think you should have is a home for your work. I think you should have a website. You know, with Ted, if I wasn't determined to get to him, I wouldn't have been able to find him because he doesn't have a website. And I would say you should have a home for your work. So maybe have that. And, you know, when piece is published, that's a place where if I'm an agent, I've read a story, stumbled on a story, and I want to read more, I want to be able to go to your website and find you and get in contact, right? But social media, if you're not interested in it, don't do it. Like, it's actually more of like a potential danger these days than it is necessarily a wise move to just do it because you're trying to build your followers. Now, a publisher will always encourage you to have accounts. You know, let's say open a Twitter or Facebook, whatever. They want authors to be engaged, but you know, I think you should do what feels organic to you and what you actually like doing.
But agents aren't thinking about that. When they're looking at a query letter, they're not, unless you're writing nonfiction, and that doesn't include memoir usually because you don't have to worry about social media. But you were mentioning this yesterday too, that there are things about someone who's engaged in something like Twitter where they're actually communicating with other writers and getting showing evidence of being engaged in the literary community in general is a positive thing too.
Yeah, I think in general, and that has to do with just demonstrating a seriousness about being part of this community and being engaged with it. And that goes to, you know, maybe having some publications in literary magazines, you know, being active in an organization like the Writers League or something like that. You know, we do want to see demonstrated commitment to it as opposed to, I just randomly wrote this novel and, you know, here it is.
But you also said yesterday, I think, that you were fine with someone ending their letter with...
It's true, and I'm going to directly contradict myself by... but what I would also say is that don't, in your query letter and bio, try to fluff it up with a lot of kind of not that relevant information, right? I think sometimes writers don't have, some people who aren't, don't have an MFA or don't have a bunch of credits, they'll say, you know, I've always loved writing. I've been writing since I was 8, and you know, my teachers loved my writing and they encouraged me. And you know, I wrote this YA novel that my 16-year-old niece loves, and she's told me she thinks it's great. And I live in Waco. You know, like, you don't need to do that. If you don't have those things, just a simple line that says, I live so-and-so, this is my first novel, you know, I live in wherever, and this is my first novel. There's something elegant about that and confident as well.
Great.
If a person has a substantial background in a totally different profession, should they mention that or just leave it out?
I think it might be worth, you know, a line, maybe, you know, if it's unrelated to the subject matter of the book and doesn't inform it, then I don't think it's really relevant unless, you know, it has to do with writing.
Sort of a general question, specifically for me, because my previous books were all published through indie presses. So I'm used to, or I've become accustomed to, having a lot of say with the cover, with the editing, with the marketing, doing all of that work. It raises my hackles to think that somebody will choose a cover that I'll hate, because I love all the ones I have already. So just general advice for us who are coming from, you know, indie press experience, or for those of us who are control freaks?
I think and that's a good question, and I think the main thing is probably to be very clear early with your agent, to know what your priorities are and what really is important to you. And if an agent feels like, you know what, that's a headache, I don't want to deal with that, then that's not a right match. But if an agent says like, yeah, I will fight for that, and I will let interested editors and houses know that that's important to you. On a rare occasion, if you have some leverage, you might be able to get cover approval. It is the thing that they hate giving more than anything. But maybe at a certain house, and maybe if you have the right combination of interest and leverage, you can get that.
But also you get, I think, working with an agent who gives you honest feedback where they might say, the reason they're pushing for this cover is because Barnes & Noble said if this is the cover, they'll buy 10,000 copies. If they go with the other cover, they're going to buy 4,000 copies. So suddenly it's, a key account is saying, we know what sells in our bookstore, and if you want to sell double, go with this. But the other thing is, before that process, when all that stuff is being put on the board, but you only see one or two, that's when you want, with your agent, to go to the editor and say, just so you know, these are some of the things worth it. Like, I see a barn on the cover. I see, it's important to me that there not be any humans or animals on the cover or whatever. You can offer notes very early on that can help to at least focus that process.
Yeah, exactly. And I can tell the editor also that this is an important thing, and are you going to advocate and listen to her as we talk about this? But absolutely what Rebecca was saying, and I encourage a lot of authors to do this, where it is very important to them, is very early in the process put together that kind of inspiration, and be very clear. Like, I don't want a dog on the cover, right? I know there's a dog in the book. I know it's prominent, but don't put a dog, right?
Why wouldn't you put a dog on the cover?
I know dogs
People
sell.
love dogs.
It's true. Yeah.
Or a bear. I want a bear on the cover.
Yeah. Well, with this one, actually, initially they had the wrong bear. They put in a bear, and it looked great. And he was like, yeah, but they don't have those bears in Virginia. And so what they did was actually, it's the same bear, but with a different head. Yeah.
How would you advise people? I'm working on sort of memoir / it's about bicycle riding. You do fiction. Somebody's doing that sort of stuff. What are the differences between agents? How do you find one that's more focused on that?
Yeah, I mean...
maybe even just sort of giving advice on how you find an agent that's going to be the right fit for you.
Yeah, that's a good thing, because we're trying to stay away from like very specific things. But I think that's what you're saying is like just nonfiction, essentially, and finding the right agent in general. There are resources, and I would encourage you, one, Becca was saying the other day, like, go to the stacks, the category that you're going to be in, right? Memoirs, a lot of memoirs that have a kind of exploring a certain world or a hobby, right? Maybe it's like, I was going through grief and trying to process that, and you picked up an interest, and it's shown you how to live and love again, kind of thing. There are so many memoirs like that, right? So what you want to do is look at those, and in the acknowledgments, you'll find the agent thanked almost always. The other thing is Poets and Writers has a great database of Poets and Writers, the magazine and the website that accompanies it, has a great database of agents and what they do. And finally, publishersmarketplace.com has a database of deals in there, and it identifies the house, the agent, the editor. And what you can do is figure out the fields and search for memoir. And you can just see some of them aren't going to apply to you given what their subject matter is, but some of them you'll find, and you'll be able to create a list out of that. I believe it's a $25 monthly subscription, so you can even just go on for a month. It's well worth the investment.
And I loved something you said earlier today, too, which I think sort of describes your philosophy as an agent as well. Write the kind of book that only you can write, right?
Yeah, in a certain sense, that's your platform, right? There is a combination of experiences and identity that you have that you can think is really unique, and it probably is. So use that. And when we see it, we will appreciate that, you know what, I haven't seen anything like this.
Guys, I'm guessing you might feel the way I feel, which is I could listen to Kirby Kim talk about publishing and agenting all day. Unfortunately, we can't. But can we just give this guy a big round of applause for...
This has been the Writers League of Texas podcast. For more information about the Writers League of Texas and our many programs and services for writers, visit our website at writersleague.org. Email us at wlt@writersleague.org or give us a call at 512-499-8914. Thank you for listening.